A spring election just 1 week away. A presidential primary plus some key down-ballot races are on the line. Our special report, Campaign 2024, Battleground, Wisconsin. Welcome to Wisconsin's beautiful state capital. I'm News 3 Now's Eric Franke. Next week, voters will head to the polls at the beginning of what is expected to be a very intense year of campaigning here in the Badger State. Of course, this summer, hundreds of thousands of politicians and activists will land right here in Wisconsin for the Republican National Convention, a 4-day event that is expected to solidify Donald Trump's nomination for this fall's election. Then just a month later, Democrats will travel to Chicago, gathering to do the very same for their party. And that presidential race will, of course, dominate the top of the ticket in next Tuesday's election here in Wisconsin. But there are important down-ballot races as well that will help shape local politics. And for more on that, we turn to our political reporter, Will Keneally, who has more on what's at stake in this election. Will.
Well, Eric, it's not often that Wisconsinites get to amend our state's constitution, but that's exactly what voters will be able to do on that April ballot.
Wisconsin is unusual for making it quite this difficult to amend the Constitution.
This spring, the constitutional amendment questions will make up one part of what you are likely to see when you vote in next Tuesday's election. It's 2 questions dealing with outside money in local races. Question 1, should municipalities be able to use outside money to help run their elections? Question 2, should outside contractors be allowed to help run a city's election?
Voters in democratically leaning areas by starving them of the resources they need to run elections. Private foundations like Mr. Zuckerberg's have stepped in to fill that gap.
This harkens back to 2020. During that election, a nonprofit funded by Mark Zuckerberg gave grants to more than 200 Wisconsin cities. They used that money to help run their elections during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this included some of the state's largest cities, which often favored Democrats.
I'm not conspiracy. I'm into truth.
That drew concerns from conservatives. And now this new amendment would block cities from taking that money. The second question comes from a similar conservative concern about Green Bay using an outside contractor for their elections in 2020. Those pushing for the amendments say that these are needed to ensure fairness and security in the state's elections. Constitutional expert Howard Schwaber says it could have the side effect of depressing turnout.
That is one way to diminish the clout of Democratic-leaning areas, right, as opposed to voters specifically, is to starve them of resources.
And the turnout for this April's election could make a difference on how likely these amendments are to pass.
There is a strategic calculation here that these referendum measures are more likely to pass because they're being put out at a time when turnout is likely to be very low.
We'll also see many local races on the ballot this spring, including county and school board races, as well as many school referendum votes.
In the 2021 to 2023 budget, those revenue limits were frozen altogether, and that happened to coincide with skyrocketing inflation, which caused some financial distress for many districts.
In recent years, school districts have turned to referenda amid rising costs. Their funding largely comes from 2 places: the state government and local property taxes. State law puts a cap on how much the districts can raise, and these referenda allow the local districts to exceed that cap with the consent of local taxpayers.
There are 2 main types of referenda. The first is a capital referendum, also called a debt service referendum. And those are funds that would be specifically tagged for big projects related to capital improvements, usually construction or renovations.
This year, for example, voters in the River Valley School District will be asked to okay $14.5 million for an addition to the high school's Performing Arts Center. The other type of referendum is what's called an operating referendum, when districts need more money to just keep the lights on. Wisconsin Policy Forum's Sarah Shaw says we usually see operating referenda when districts have fewer students.
Because of that declining enrollment, the school funding formula takes student enrollment as a primary factor. So if your enrollment's going down, your revenue limit is going down as well. And similarly, low-income districts are more likely to pass operating referenda, and high-income districts are more likely to pass capital referenda.
The idea here that districts with increasing enrollment need to build more to house more students. If you see the word recurring by your referendum, that means that the district wants that raise forever. Non-recurring means that raise will sunset.
Part of why we may be seeing a higher number of districts going to referendum in this cycle, because the federal relief funding for pandemic aid is now going away and districts are having to really face what their current constraints are.
And voters will be able to decide April 2nd.
All right, Will, and a lot of people are wondering about turnout for April 2nd. The presidential nominees have all but been decided at this point. How do you think that might impact turnout?
Yeah, so there's not a lot of like that really interesting stuff at the presidential level for Wisconsinites to vote for. We will see perhaps some on the Democratic side, Democrats voting kind of this uncommitted sense as kind of a protest vote against Biden over the U.S.'s policy in Israel right now. The other interesting thing to note is when we talk about turnout, low turnout has traditionally favored Republicans. It's those voters that always turn out, off your elections, those municipal races as well. So we could see a traditionally more conservative electorate this time around, but Wisconsin's been shifting a little bit. The people that vote in those off-year elections, those tend to be more educated voters. And since we've seen in the last couple of elections, those have shifted a little bit more towards the Democratic side.
What are some of the really key things you're going to be keeping an eye on April 2nd?
April 2nd, certainly those two constitutional amendments. Again, like we were saying before, this is not something that Wisconsinites get to do all that often. Mm-hmm. It's a rare chance. And it's one of those things where voters get to weigh in directly. We don't get those kind of propositions like you see in California. So this is one of those few instances where Wisconsinites will be able to directly kind of use their voice to sway Wisconsin law here.
All right, some things to watch from our political reporter, Will Keneally.